Apologize about that. I accidentally clicked the home screen and the recording stopped. So we were just at so we printed out the first part of this, got the next line, printed out line. So we should have this space line. We have a tab here, so it's going to be separated by a tab. So we'll p. So after we have line, then we call p points to strtok null, comma white space. Then it should get has. P is going to point to has, so now it's holding has. So it's not equal. So p is not equal to null. We're going to step in. Printf p, so it's going to print has. P is going to point to the next token, so it should collect 5. Same process. So it has 5. It's not null. It should print. P then points to different. Different in our local variable. See that P? You can see that P is pointing to different. Then P is not equal to null. That should be true, so it's stepping into the loop. If it was false, it'd skip the loop, but it's not. It's true, so we're executing the print statement again. Then P points strtok, passing in null, same thing, and the white space, so it currently points a different, and should now, after we execute this line, point to words. Points to words. Now P is not equal to null. Step in, print. If you click the external console, you should see all those words that we went through printed. Or you should see the string printed, in the tokens separated by the tab. Then P points strtok again, passing in null. At this point, it should point to null. See? It says P points to null. In our character array, that pointer just means array. So it's another way to write array. So null. P points to null. Well, P is not equal to null, so the loop should get skipped because it's false. Excuse me, so there you go. So now, we'll continue with the next code. If I can just pull that up here. On my notes, so we'll move on to functions. We'll stop debugging. Yeah, stop that. So we'll get into functions. It's not the best example, but I believe it is in the C programming book by Dennis Ritchie and Brian Kerningham. It's from that book, I believe. So we'll just do the example. So I'll remove that. Remove all that. Actually, we can keep the stdio.h. Delete the inside of that function. So we have int main. They didn't put any parameters in here. Same thing, I guess. So we're going to have something above main. It's a new concept, so it's called a prototype. So before you can, if you want to call a function below main, you have to prototype it, I believe, or else it has to be above main. So just remember to prototype it. All you do is you just copy the parameter types inside. Usually I just call them the same thing so I don't get confused. But they did it this way. Did I change my keyboard? Yeah, I did. Okay, so int power int m comma int n, so it takes two int parameters. So this function here is a prototype. And it takes two int parameters. Then below we have our main function. So we say so we'll declare a variable int I. Then we'll have a for loop here. So we'll say for int I is equal to 0, I is less than 2, I plus plus. So we'll say printf %d, 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 so 3% d's, new line. So we'll pass in I, then the function power 2 comma I, and the function power 3 comma I. And at the bottom we'll have return 0. So here we'll write our function. So this is the function. Should be outside of main. Okay, so yeah, we'll have it. This shouldn't have any brackets. Even if you don't need it, I always put brackets just to be clear, because it's sometimes if you're looking at it quickly, it's like, well, you have to check if it's really connected to the for loop and what's not. So I always just put them in brackets anyways. But they didn't. It's good practice to not, just in case you're not used to that. So here we'll just have our function int power. We'll pass in an int base and an int n. We'll say int I and p. P points to 1 initially. And we'll say for I is equal to 1. I is less than or equal to n. I plus plus. Then we'll say p points to p times base. And then at the bottom we'll just return p. So this is our function here, and that's our main function. Whoops. So basically in a function we're just calling, in the main function we're calling a function, another function. And we're going to pass in parameters. And from those parameters it's going to calculate, so 2 in this case, in this call 2 is the base. And then n is I. Right, so it's kind of tricky if you don't name them the same. But base is 2, so anytime base is called, it just gets saved to 2. Anytime n is called, it's just going to be saved to whatever I is. So we'll debug it. We'll set a breakpoint here and here. I'll hit Control S to save it, and then I'll click the debug icon. So initially I should be 0. Once we step over the line. So I is equal to 0, I is less than 2, I plus plus. So it really will only iterate twice, I think. So we'll step in, printf %d, %d, %d. So what, weirdly enough, I think it gets this one first. It's going to go to this function first. It's going to step into this one and then this one. I feel like it's a glitch by C-line itself. But I don't think it really matters. But maybe that's just the way it does that. So perhaps it gets the right function first, but I thought it should be the left one first. But that's alright. So when we step in, and you can see that the base is 3, so it did get the one on the right first. So the base is 3 and n is 0 because I was 0, right? It's because it passed in I for n. So I was 0, and since I was 0 in this case, then n would be 0. So int I p, it declares those variables. I guess another I. Yeah. So it's going to say, okay, well, p points to 1. For I is equal to 1, I is less than or equal to n, so what's our n? Our n is 0. So for I is equal to 1, I is less than or equal to 0. So is 1 less than or equal to 0? I think it's false, so it should get skipped. Return p, p is 1. So for this function call, it's just going to return 1. So now automatically I believe this function got called, passing in 2 and I. So after this one got completed, that got a value of 1, I think. That got saved to a value of 1, so it should print out 1 for that %d. And then now we've moved on to this one, power 2 comma I. So now once we stepped in, we stepped into this function itself, passing these parameters of this one. We're stepping into this one, not this one, the one on the left here that I just highlighted. So 2 and I was 1. No. Was it 1? Int I p points to 1. Did I step over something twice? As I feel like I should have been 0 still. Okay, let me just stop that for a second, re-debug it. Whoops. Okay, so step in, I is 0, step over, that got skipped, return p. Something glitched here? No? Because nothing got, it might be. So step in. It could be a garbage value. Oh, it could be a garbage value. That could be a garbage value for I because this one was different than this. There's two different I's. One's a local one for main and one's a local one for power. So once we stepped in, the one from main, we can't see it anymore. So that might just be a garbage value. That's the thing with C, it can get confusing with the garbage values too. That was one of its setbacks. So right now we'll just go with p points to 1 for I is equal to 1. I is less than or equal to n. So n is 0. Should get skipped. There we go. Now I is equal to 1 because we finally initialized it to 1. Then return p, which is equal to 1 because p was equal to 1. Step in. Just into. I don't know what happened there. Okay, so that was our first iteration of this for loop. Then we'll step in again. So I was 0 plus 1, I will become 1. So now we're going to pass in 1 for all the calls of I. And it's going to start with the right one again. So if we step in, you can't just step, because if you just step over the printf, what happened is it printed, when I was like, I don't know what happened, it went to a built-in function printf, and it printed everything, because once those get calls, it goes back to the printf. So we have the power, we're going to step in, and it should pass in I equals to 1. So there we go, we stepped into this one. It doesn't really tell you. Also one of its setbacks, but like in C-line setbacks, most debuggers are like that, it won't really tell you. So you kind of just have to know that it's this one. So in power we passed in 1 for I. So n should be equal to 1. And base is 3. Base points to 3. N points to 1. So we have p points to 1, we step over. For I is equal to 1, I is less than or equal to n. So it is equal to this time, because I is 1. And n is 1. So 1 is less than or equal to 1, because it's equal to. Step in. So p points to p times base. So p points to 1 times 3. This loop should be false now. Then return p. P is 3. So it's going to return 3 for this function call itself. Because this function returns an int. Whoops. It returns an int value, not like a void. If we return void, it's not going to return a value. But since it returns int for this call itself, it's going to return a 1. It's going to return a 3. Because that's what p was. So step in. Okay, so now then we passed in 2 and 1. Sorry, n should be equal to 1. I should just be a garbage value. So p points to 1. For I is equal to 1, I is less than or equal to 1, I plus plus. P points to p times base, so p points to 1 times 2. Then this loop should be false because I is now equal to 2 once we step over. So 2 is not less than or equal to 1. And then return p, which is 2. That's our printf again, so we'll just try to step out. So I was 1, if we step in, it should be false. And return 0, so that's it. That should be our machine code. So we have the values printed. So yeah, that's the end of the functions code. Hopefully you guys understand. It's just like we prototyped it at the top to call it. It takes 2 ints. You have to put what types it takes. I guess the name can be whatever you want, as long as the types are corresponding. Then we called main, had our loops. We went over loops already. Then we had our printf. The printf calls the function itself. We started with this one. We stepped into, so once we stepped into, just connect an arrow here. We step into this function here, pass in 3 for base, I for n, then step in. You can check your values in the local values. Again, global variables don't get shown, which also can be confusing, but hopefully you guys understand this code. And I'll see you guys in the next video. If you like the video, you can like it. You can subscribe to the channel for more programming videos, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.